Good morning, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to our Stormwater Task Force public forum. This is an update meeting that we have been attempting to schedule here for probably the last 3 to 4 months. It has been constantly interrupted by the issue that we all know as COVID-19. But we're certainly happy that we can finally pull this event off and present information to you that we feel is extremely relevant with respect to stormwater management in Plum Borough. So let me introduce myself first. My name is Dave Odom. I'm the Plum Council President, and I'm also a member of the Stormwater Task Force. I'll also be introducing members of the task force here as we go through the presentation. We're certainly excited for those of you who are joining us here today in person. And for those of you who will ultimately be able to watch the video on our YouTube channel, we certainly appreciate you taking interest in the information that we have to present to you this morning. Let's start by taking a look at our agenda and the topics that we're going to cover. We'll start by providing you with a Stormwater Task Force overview, and that will include the background on the task force, information associated with the annual work that has been conducted for stormwater management, and then we'll also provide you with a brief overview of the financial expenses and grants that we have pursued in support of our stormwater projects. That will be followed by a presentation by individuals from KU Resources. They're going to provide a historical overview of stormwater management in Plum Borough. A lot of good information there relative to the historical aspects of stormwater management. And then they'll also provide information associated with our long-term projects, both the O-Block and Center Beach projects that we have been pursuing over the course of the Stormwater Task Force inception. And then we'll have a presentation by Mike Thomas, who's going to discuss retention ponds, which is a very important topic that the task force has been working on over the course of the last 6 months. And then we have a special guest with us from the Penn State Cooperative Education Group, who's going to provide information on stormwater educational topic and some best management practices. And we will conclude our meeting with public comment, question and answer forum. We certainly invite those of you who are present here today to talk about any of the information that you'd like to bring up to the task force, specifically questions that you have on the information that's been presented, or just any relative concerns that you might have. This is the time for you to talk about those things to the task force members who are here today, and we certainly welcome the opportunity to hear from you. I think that's one of the primary reasons that we have this forum, is to hear from members of our public. And then we will adjourn, and hopefully we can keep on our timetable and adjourn on time at 12 o'clock. So with that, I'd also like to say we have a small group here. This is somewhat of an intimate setting, so if you did want to speak relative to asking questions about information that we're presenting during the course of the presentations, you certainly feel free to do so. With the small numbers that we have, I think that's certainly appropriate. So with that, we'll move on with our agenda and start with our overview of the task force, and I will be providing this portion of the presentation. So a little bit of background. Certainly I know most people are familiar with the event that occurred back in 2019 when our community was impacted by a very disastrous rainstorm that left probably about 3 inches of water in a number of areas throughout our borough. This torrential rainfall that we had impacted multiple properties, not just residential, but also commercial. We had individuals who had in excess of 4 feet of water in their homes, nearby creeks that were overflowing, and the overall impact to our residents and business was catastrophic. I know that many individuals were recovering from this particular event, not days, not weeks, but months. And I think some are still, dealing with some of the fallout from that particular event, and that was ultimately the event that spawned the creation of the task force. So the purpose of this meeting is to really provide you with information on what the task force has been doing over the course of the last year. We're going to talk about some of the accomplishments, the initiatives, and the information that's being planned for the future. The goals of the Stormwater Task Force, when it was originally created, was to develop a charter to define our overall mission, goals, and objectives of our committee, review history of the borough's development to discuss some of the issues surrounding existing stormwater management systems, reviewing current processes and procedures for stormwater management, taking a look at the source of funding that can be used to support stormwater management projects, and also whether or not we could leverage additional funds in order to complete some of the needed projects that we had in the area of stormwater management. Reviewing areas from some of the recent flooding events that had taken place, and categorizing some of those areas in order to prioritize some of the mitigations that we needed to put in place for those areas. Taking a look at root cause analysis of the flooding in areas to make sure we understood what the contributors were, and being able to identify some of those root causes so that we could come up with resolutions for those issues. Defining the scope of the borough's responsibility with respect to stormwater management. That was one of the items that we identified as an issue that needed to be addressed. And then determining potential solutions for each of the affected areas that we had identified. Some of the other items that we identified as goals for the task force was to look at how we can implement some solutions based on the technical feasibility, the implementation time, the cost, and the scope of the overall solution. Coming up with educational programs that provide residents with information on basic stormwater concepts and best practices. This meeting is obviously fulfilling that goal that we had identified for the task force. Setting realistic timelines for implementation of some of the solutions that we develop. Recommending those solutions to the Borough Council for implementation. And then communicating the progress of the task force through a report at the monthly council voting meetings. So how is the Stormwater Task Force constructed, made up, and formed? It currently consists of 3 council members, 1 Plum Borough Streets and Road Supervisor, Plum Borough staff member, Plum Borough engineer, and then 5 at-large Plum Borough residents. This is currently a listing of the task force committee members as it currently stands today. What I would like to do when I identify the names of the task force members that are present here today is just to have you briefly say your name and how long you've been on the task force, and any other relevant information based on your background that you'd like the public to be aware of. So today on the task force we have Councilman Paul Dern, myself, Dave Odom, and then Councilman Dave Vento. Mike Thomas is the borough manager. Dave Sabosley is the assistant borough manager. Bill Benora from the municipal authority. Mike DeGilio from the municipal authority. And then I'll turn it over first to our borough resident, Bill Chapla, to introduce himself and talk about his role in the task force. Bill.
Hi, Bill Chapla. I've been on the task force for almost a year now. Sorry. I think what has come out of the task force, I think the residents of the borough are going to be surprised. You know, we need to finalize these projects. Not only is it going to benefit the stormwater runoff, but the one project, Center Beach, it's actually going to be a place for everybody to enjoy if we finally put a shovel in the ground and get it going. So, thanks. You go.
My name's Costa. I've been on the task force since its working. My name's Dave Reynolds. I was a pipe fitter, steam fitter for 40 years. I've been on the task force since its inception. Like many of the people who've come to these meetings, I was affected by the storm, and I had issues prior to that storm over the years. So I wanted to get in and see what's going on with this flood water, what the problem is. I wish there were a lot more people here today, because when it rains, they're all going to be here wanting to know what's happening. If you were here today, we could give you some oversight as to what we're trying to do. This problem didn't arrive overnight. It's not going to go away overnight. But I was surprised at how much time and effort is actually being put into this that I didn't realize. So we're trying to do our best, and we're trying to get something done that hadn't been done before. So we hope we can get something done to help all the residents. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. In addition to these individuals that you see here this morning, we also have Borough resident Terry Cyphers, and we also have Bob Mytall, Borough engineer, Tyson Miller from KU Resources, which is here to my left, and Lenny White also participates from KU Resources. And that is the collective listing of the Stormwater Task Force members. So one of the things that we first started working on when we formed the task force was to identify the impacted areas, predominantly from the 2019 event, but also areas of concern that we knew were prone to flooding. This is a view of the geographic area that includes more than 250 homes and businesses that had been impacted by flooding. You obviously see a number of the residential areas that are probably familiar to you. Kirk Drive, which has about 30 homes. Anderson Avenue, 10 homes were impacted by flooding. Unity Center, which is predominantly business related. Key West, Pine Valley, Holiday Park, businesses on Route 286, and some additional areas including Chaparral Drive, Leroy Street, and some others that you see listed here on this slide. It was important for the task force to identify these areas so that we could come up with holistic solutions that, in my opinion, were developed to kind of provide the most bang for the buck, so to speak. If we could come up with a solution to cover several areas as opposed to targeting each one, it would certainly put us in a position where we could capitalize our funds to address some of the more areas prone to being impacted by flooding. The initial strategy of the task force was to divide our efforts into short-term and long-term solutions. Based on the identification of the aforementioned impacted areas. And this strategy was predominantly chosen so that we could make incremental progress on several areas of concern while we were addressing the more larger systemic issues that we knew we had in the borough. We identified specific estimated completion dates for the short-term solutions, and we tracked those short-term solutions at each of our meetings to completion. And then we developed the long-term projects with input from our borough engineer. And to date, all of the short-term projects have been completed, and you'll be receiving an update on the status of all of the long-term projects, specifically the O Block and Center Beach projects. And I think there's a lot of good information to be discussed, and our representative from KU Resources, Tyson Miller, is going to be providing you with that update. So the next item that we wanted to give you some visibility into is associated with the annual work summary and financial expenses and grants overview. The reason why we thought this was an important topic to provide is so that you could get some visibility into the actual expenses associated with the stormwater work, as well as a overview of the annual work that's actually been completed since we met last year. Now, this information is going to be difficult for you to see here on the screen. So what we did is we provided you with handouts so that you don't have the eyeball strain that you would normally have from looking at it on the screen. This first slide really gives a collection of the stormwater work that has been completed since our last annual meeting. As you can see, a lot of it is infrastructure-based. It covers a span of several different communities, including Holiday Park, Frankstown areas, Renton, and East Oakmont. Several projects that were completed over the course of the last year to replace storm pipes, catch basins, and things of that nature. The next set of information provides a summary of the stormwater expenses, and it's really done in lieu of all of the additional services that we have to budget for within the borough. You'll see in bold the amount that's spent over the course of the last 5 years on stormwater management. You can see in 2017, it was about $1 million. Again, 2018, $1 million. It bumped up to $3 million in 2019. Dropped a little bit in 2020. I think that was predominantly due to COVID. And then, as you can see, a very substantial investment. A lot of that is being directed at our annual work and our long-term projects here in 2021. But as you can see, if you look at the 5-year average, it's about $2 million that we're spending on stormwater management. And that in itself is the second highest item that we have budgeted from a fiscal perspective in the Plum budget. When you look at things like police, sanitation, public works, roads resurfacing. So we have a very significant amount of our budget that's currently being allocated to stormwater management. And I think that's a good thing, right? There's a reason for that, because if we don't allocate the funds that we need to complete these projects, then we know that we'll ultimately be dealing with these issues for the foreseeable future. So one of the important things that we do on the task force is to take a look at the budget allocation, and the borough staff provides us with this type of information so that we can have a good understanding of what's being spent and that our fiscal dollars are being capitalized in a manner that allows us to address some of the issues that we have in stormwater management. The next slide just kind of gives you a overview of the sources of stormwater expenses from 2010 all the way to 2021. So we're looking at a 10-year summary of different types of stormwater expenses. So you can see we're looking at funds that have been allocated from the general fund, our street improvement fund, our flood mitigation fund, our capital projects, as well as some of our other equipment and maintenance type funding that we allocate to support overall stormwater management. So this again is just to kind of give you an overview of where the funds are coming from and the fact that they're being allocated towards stormwater management. And certainly, Mike Thomas, as I'm going through this, if I mess anything up, feel free to jump in and add any additional detail. And then finally, this I think is a really important slide. This is a listing of the grant dollars that we have for stormwater management over the course of 2020 and 2021. We've been able to get upwards of $1 million to support a number of the projects that we've been developing and working on in the area of stormwater management. As you can see here, the Oakmont East project, the Holiday Park, all 3 phases received numerous funds for the respective dates that the projects are going to be completed in, or that the projects are going to be worked in. $200,000 for Oakmont East, about $400,000 for the entirety of the Holiday Park phases. Then our O-Block long-term project got $150,000 grant, or actually projected 2022 grant, and then the same for Center Beach, $250,000. So I think that is really important to highlight the fact that we're actively seeking grant dollars for stormwater work that we have in the borough, and that we're not just relying on taxpayer dollars. It's all taxpayer dollars, but not just relying on local taxpayer dollars, but we're pursuing grants at the state level in order to allocate funds to support our stormwater projects. And with that, we'll transition to the next item on our agenda, which is the historical overview and status of our long-term projects. And providing this portion of the presentation is going to be Tyson Miller from KU Resources.
All right, good morning, everyone. As Dave mentioned, Tyson Miller with KU Resources. So I'm going to talk a little bit about stormwater management within the borough and the history over the last several decades, and then go into a little more in-depth update on the long-term projects that Dave mentioned. So stormwater management in general, obviously it's been raining forever, but regulations to manage that have really only come out in the last couple of decades. So the Clean Water Act in 1972 was kind of the first major step to allow states and municipalities to be able to regulate that. Particularly in Plum Borough, we did not have any stormwater management ordinances prior to the 1990s. But as you know, Plum Borough has been around for a while, and as you can see on the slide, about 77% of the residential and commercial build-out within the borough occurred prior to the adoption of any stormwater management ordinances. So that is, to some degree, a reason that we do have flooding in the community that we're now trying to retroactively address. And of the communities that have been developed after the 90s, and particularly the ones in the 2000s, stormwater management regulations have only begun to increase. And as a result, generally you'll see less flooding issues in those developments because the sizing of the stormwater retention areas, for instance, is commensurate with the amount of development. So again, when we're talking about these long-term projects, oftentimes we're trying to target some of the older parts of the borough that don't have stormwater management in place. So the first stormwater management ordinance in the borough was adopted in 1992. It was amended several times as different regulations came out from the state, particularly with the implementation of the MS4 program. MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Water System. And so pretty much, it's not every municipality, but it's, I think it's about 80% of municipalities across the state are enrolled in an MS4 program. So, you know, from small boroughs and townships all the way up to first-class cities, first and second-class cities, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. So we're all required to meet certain levels of stormwater management, and there's several different factors. There's 6 main components that go into that MS4 program. We're not going to do too deep of a dive on that, but if you have specific questions, certainly you can talk to myself or some of the borough staff about the MS4 program. But MS4 in general addresses rate, quality, and volume. So those are 3 distinct parts of stormwater management. Older stormwater management ordinances really focused on rate, so that's why you see in a lot of older developments large ponds. So water would come in, they would hold it back, and then it would kind of release it over time. Over the last 2 decades, there's been more of a focus on both stormwater volume and stormwater quality. So stormwater volume is really an attempt to try to mimic the natural hydrologic functions of the land so that we can recharge the water into the groundwater system and just not have it all end up in the Gulf of Mexico. And stormwater quality primarily focuses on nitrogen, potassium, sediment. Those are kind of 3 of the major components, and then there's a larger subset of other constituents that new enhanced stormwater management features can try to remove from the stormwater prior to it getting into the pipes and streams. So the current stormwater ordinances we have on on the books. There are two. One is for floodplain management and the other is for stormwater management. The stormwater management was most recently adopted in 2018, and it was revised largely due to the adoption of an Act 167 plan within Allegheny County. So right now, about 30% of the state has an active Act 167 plan, which is sort of more of a concerted effort to look at stormwater rate, volume, and quality, and kind of provide standardized requirements for all the municipalities. So in the case of Allegheny County, every municipality was required to adopt an ordinance equal to or greater than the requirements of the model ordinance in the Act 167 plan. This also allowed us to have fees that we can put in for ongoing maintenance and inspection of stormwater BMPs, whether that's for BMPs that are owned by the borough or BMPs that are installed and maintained by developers. So it gives the borough the authority to go in and inspect and or maintain those privately held stormwater management features in the event that they are not being properly managed. We are in the process of updating the ordinance again. There were some items in the model stormwater ordinance that basically just kind of got adopted verbatim that, you know, after having lived with it for 3 years, we were looking to change some additional fees that we're going to add in, as Mike will talk a little bit about some of the stormwater management work we're going to do on the retention ponds. You know, we need to have a mechanism to be able to fund stormwater maintenance into the future. And while we do have a stormwater fee, which is fairly nominal, I think someone's going to talk about that, right? Or not. But anyway, as most borough residents are aware, we have a stormwater fee that's fairly nominal that we use to fund a lot of these stormwater projects. So the current projects, and there's two current ones that we're working on, and I'm going to talk about two other ones that are going to be a little bit further in the future. But as Dave mentioned, they're the O Block Road project and the Center Beach project. So the O Block Road project, there's an existing pond at the intersection of O Block Road and Key West Drive that we're looking to expand and enhance. Center Beach, for those of you that might be familiar, was the site of a swimming pool back in the 50s and 60s that's been a vacant land that we've identified as a potential spot for a stormwater management area. In general, Dave and the Stormwater Task Force, you know, part of their initial charter and initial goals was to identify these potential stormwater management areas, and we like to look at places that are as far up in a watershed as possible. So by that, if you can capture the water upstream, you know, and keep it from flowing downstream, that's going to be best. And in many cases, those areas that are downstream are completely built out. So in the case of the O Block Road pond, you know, below that is the Pine Valley Drive, which is, you know, completely built out on both sides of the road with residences. So we're trying to, you know, find a location upstream of that in order to capture the water and slow it down as much as possible. So we'll go into detail about these two. So, but generally, when looking to design these, we have certain methodology that we use. So we estimate the land cover conditions from various sources, including the borough's GIS database, as well as other publicly available pieces of information. Also in those GIS databases, the property lines are in there, the contours are in there, aerial images, and so forth. And from that, we can start to determine how much runoff is going to be generated at a particular point. And then we look at different rainfall data to determine what, you know, as Dave mentioned, the best bang for the buck. That helps us determine what we might be able to do. So, you know, we're not ever able to capture all of the stormwater just because it is such a huge volume, but we can try to do as best we can at each project location. So, just for reference, you'll see here some typical nomenclature that's used. There's the 99th percentile storm, the 90th percentile storm, and the 80th percentile storm. Basically, that means a 90th percentile storm means that 90% of all storms that we experience are 1 inch of rainfall or less. And again, with the 99th percentile, 2.1 inches. Now, that 2019 storm obviously exceeded that 99th percentile storm. So, you know, obviously that was an unfortunate incident and it caused a lot of damage, but at the same time, it's very difficult to design, as I said, a stormwater management system that can capture and manage every storm. So there's always going to be some risk of a storm event exceeding what we can design for just because of the available space that we have and the funds that we have to construct these systems. So just, you know, we never want to construe this as a silver bullet, but, you know, as Dave mentioned, these are attempts to improve what we have now and continue to working towards, you know, making it better. There's also software, it's publicly available, it's on the internet, called StreamStats, and you can go into this website, click on a particular stream, it will delineate what the drainage area is and will also tell you what the flow characteristics are, what the peak flows are for the common, what we call recurrence intervals, a 2-year storm, 10-year storm, 100-year storm, et cetera. So if you're curious as to, you know, how much water is getting through a bridge or a pipe at a certain point, you can use this website very quickly and just get some of that information. So just to talk about O-Block, and I can't read the fine print there. So the O-Block Road project, hopefully you can see the red outline is, you know, what we put together from the GIS databases. So this, you know, the areas of Key West Drive, O-Block Drive, you know, Larry Mills Park. I happen to live up by Amplified Church, so Amplified Church, Parkside Estates, part of Boyce Park. That's all within the drainage area that's going to be draining to this proposed area, which you can see listed as 1.4 square miles, so which is just about 900 acres. So you can see the statistics for the different storms. Again, the 80th percentile storm, 151,000 cubic feet. When you get to the 99th percentile storm, you know, almost 1.8 million. So again, we're talking about a lot of water. So with the project currently, it's under review for a couple of different permits. There's an NPDES permit that's required, and there's also a joint permit that's required. So the NPDES permit is through the Allegheny County Conservation District. They're looking at erosion and sediment as well as the stormwater calculations, whereas the joint permit, which is so named because it is a permit that's jointly issued by the Department of Environmental Protection and the Army Corps, that permit is for review of environmental impacts. So, get into that in a little more detail here. So, was that a laser pointer on it? Whoops. Nope. That was the wrong one. What do I gotta do now? I don't know what I did either. The middle button? Okay. So, right here is about the location of the existing pond. And we're proposing, not quite to double it, but we're proposing to expand it over into this area as well. Well, unfortunately, there's a small stream that runs right here. So, again, as I mentioned, the joint permit that is review of those environmental impacts. There are some environmental impacts related to relocating that stream. So, so that's what the permit for the joint permit is for. But the intent of what this is right now, this pond receives runoff from the Key West area and also the development that's on Sika Drive. Those drain into this pond. They go out an outlet structure and out into the stream. So what we're proposing to do is modify the emergency spillway, which is in this location, to allow it to accept water from the stream. So water will actually flow into the stream when the stream reaches a certain height, and then it will be restricted and flow back out at a later time and at a lower rate. So, you know, I always try to explain this as like a bathtub. So you have your water coming in as a perhaps as a gush, and then the drain is a little bit smaller, so it's going out a little bit slower. So it starts to fill up, and then it will, eventually drain out at a much slower rate. So I don't think there's too much more. I mean, if anyone has specific questions as to what we're doing or how we're doing it, I can get into that. But for the most part, it's going to remain and look like a pond. We'll have some landscaping and things like that. So, certainly anything we put in isn't going to be an eyesore. But generally speaking, it's a pond, and that's what its function is.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is that this project is being done specifically to address the problems that those homes on Pine Valley experienced in 2019. That was why we selected this site, because of the areas that were most impacted by those storms. This was one that we were able to identify that was, that we could have significant impact, and that we already had control of the property, and we could do something with it relatively quickly. Which I know when you hear us say relatively quickly, you're thinking it's 2021. These processes are not simply a 30, 60, 90-day process, unfortunately. And I think that's what maybe even Bill Chappell was referring to when he said it's just realizing how long these things take. But that's why we chose this project specifically.
And that's a great point. And not only Pine Valley Drive, in theory, this watershed is also draining the water that gets to 286. So, all the businesses that were impacted in 2019, the garden center and in Puglianos, all of those, this is water that was contributing towards that. So, yeah, good point. Center Beach, slightly smaller. It's just under a square mile. This project has several different permits. Similar to the O-Block project, it has an NPDES permit and a joint permit. This project also has a dam permit that's required, and I'll explain that here in a moment. So, as was mentioned, one of we think one of the nice things about this project is it's not just a stormwater management project. We're able to integrate this and create a new public space. So the intent would be that this would be a new little public park that could be used for all of the residents. So I'll go into a little more detail of what we're going to do here. So we have the main stem of Plum Creek flowing this direction, and then we have a tributary coming this direction. This is Salzburg Road right here, and for those of you familiar, Bordura cabinets are here, and the intersection with Unity Trestle is right down this way. So again, similar to what Mike had said about the selection for the O-Block site, this site is also a reflection of that 2019 flood in that there were multiple commercial businesses that were affected right on 286 at the intersection with Unity Trestle, as well as multiple homes that were affected along Anderson Avenue. So this location is upstream of both of those sites, which in theory, again, will help us mitigate that for everything that's downstream. So what we're doing here, instead of compared to the O-Block site where the pond is next to the stream, in this case, we're actually putting new structures within the stream. So we basically have a kind of a series of small little dams and ponds that will cascade into each other. So water will back up from this structure and into the next one. Similar here, will back up and then fill into this piece, and then ultimately into this one, and then back into the stream. So this one has quite a bit more stream impact. Because it's inline and not offline, that's why it requires a dam permit. Each individual weir we have does actually not qualify as a dam in terms of height. It's really because of the drainage area that gets to it. So everything over 200 acres of drainage that gets impounded. I'm sorry, anything that has a tributary area of over 200 acres that has an impoundment across it has to apply for a dam permit. So this project basically has been fully designed, and we were waiting to submit permits until the borough was able to obtain property ownership. I don't know if you have an update, but I know there was a...
Yes, we do. I'm happy to say that we are closing next week on the property. So council approved $255,000 to purchase the property, and we'll be submitting the application as well as now that we have secured the property, we'll be able to finalize our grant application for the property.
Yep. And so I think we have to submit for the grant by August maybe August 1st, or in the next 2 weeks, we actually have to resubmit that grant application now that the borough can show proof of ownership. And then we'll be able to submit the permit applications to the DEP and the Conservation District. So,
And just one, comment, and this is like kind of a bone of contention I have with this whole stormwater management, I guess, process, right? I was educated, as well as a number of others on the task force, with the litany of things that have to be done in order to get something done. It is very frustrating. When we sit in the meetings and we're talking about NPDES permits and joint permits, and I'm like, really? Like, can we just go do this? Like, why does it take so long? Why? Because there's all of these regulations in order to, actually get the work that we want to do accomplished. I don't know how we change that. I've kind of sat here and scratched my head, and I know Bill, and others, they've all felt the same way. Like there's got to be a better way. Unfortunately, there isn't. These environmental concerns and all these things that we have to deal with, just to fix something it's very frustrating. But we're getting there, which is important. I mean, just the land acquisition part of it. I'm like, what do you mean we don't own? I'm just pretty naive. I'm thinking, well, we own that, right? No, we don't own that property. Well, how do we get ownership of it? Well, we have to buy it. Well, how do we buy it? Well, we have to present an offer to the individual who owns it, and then that's a process. And so it's just there's a lot that goes into it. It's not as easy as just go fix it, which I kind of initially was thinking just I'm an ex-military guy. I'm like, just go fix it, and it doesn't work that way. But I think the good thing is having the task force have visibility into it and working with the borough and the borough engineer. I think it now gives us the opportunity not just to prioritize these things and make sure that they're being worked to completion, but also start discussing, okay, how do we get in front of some of these things? If we know that they're going to take X amount of time to complete, how do we get in front of these things so that we can start working them before we have the next big problem? And so when you talked about some of these additional projects that we're going to be working on, we know we're going to have to get started on these things now in order to make sure that we can have them done by 2024. It sounds crazy. It is crazy, but it's the reality of the world that we live in when it comes to working on some of these big projects. So I'm sorry to sound.
That's why a lot of developers go to Ohio and Virginia, because it's a little quicker there. But unfortunately, that's the world we live in.
No, I was just going to say, I think, in response to Mr. Odom's point, the actual work, once we get this approved and everything, the actual work will probably be somewhere around 60 to 90 days. But to get to that point, and there's so many, not just the permits, but then, these projects have to be publicly bid, which add time to all these things. And there's just so many moving parts to this that takes a project that you would think, well, how long is it going to take me to get a dump truck in there and an excavator in there, dig some land up, put a different outflow structure in? That's probably 30 days. It's the 1,200 days before that it takes you to get to that point where the frustration comes in. And that kind of leads me to one real quick point that I'd like to make, and that is, I think one of the things that I see most often with people in the borough, in all communities in Pennsylvania, in this issue, but on all issues, is they don't realize that municipalities in Pennsylvania don't have the authority that they think they do. Pennsylvania is a commonwealth. One of the reasons, as opposed to a state, one of the things that one of the implications of that is municipalities cannot do anything that is not a power legislated to them by the state. It's different in some other states. So we're the kids, we're the children, state's the parents. We can't do anything without their permission. And I think that's another reason why people get frustrated, because they call us and they say, hey, why aren't you doing this? I need their permission. And that's also a big source of frustration for the residents, as well as, quite honestly, as us as well.
If I could just make a brief comment. Being a victim myself, I find it troubling that the state is more concerned about these environmental issues than people's lives. It's disturbing.
You're absolutely right. You're kind of echoing some of the, sentiment of a number of us in some of our meetings where we're like, why can't we just go in there with, a backhoe and just, and you can do that, but we'll be in big trouble if we do that, unfortunately. But I felt the same way. I'm like, we're talking about the lives and the livelihood of the residents of this community, and you're telling me that we've got to go through, 9 months of paperwork in order to get something done? Like that, in my opinion, that process is just broken. So, one of the things I think we need to start doing collectively, start talking to our state representatives and start saying, why is this like this? There's got to be a better way. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm kind of going to be personally taking up in my role as councilman to see, is there something that we can do? And I get it. It's going to be fighting up a large hill that I'm sure others have tried to climb in the past. But this, really, this is ridiculous. Like there has to be a better way. We'll see how things progress. We're going to obviously work within the confines of the rules as they've established them, but I think it's time to maybe do some questioning of those rules. So,
Good luck. So I'll just point out, the recreation aspect of this. So you'll see we have a little parking lot here, probably a little pavilion, and there's walking trails all along these ponds. So these are going to be really nicely landscaped. Well, I didn't show the landscape plan here, but we have the plans available if anyone's interested in it. I think the hiking or the trail is about a half-a-mile loop, so it'll be a nice little amenity for the borough. Okay. So the future stormwater projects that we have, one is Anderson Avenue and the other is College Avenue. So these were ones we've been kind of working on them and talking about them the whole time. But as Mike and Dave both alluded to, because of the time and expense that goes into these projects, it was determined that we kind of just need to bite off what we can now and just kind of do this in a progression. So the Anderson Avenue project has a fairly huge drainage area because it's below even the Center Beach area. You can see it's 1.66 square miles over 1,000 acres. It's similar to Center Beach. It would need all three permits, the NPDS, the joint permit, and a dam permit. So what that project we're envisioning would have a series of weirs also in line. We're not proposing to make this one as an amenity because it's really not accessible to the public because it's kind of behind public property and down in a valley. But for anyone that's ever been down there, it's a big wide open floodplain right now, and basically we would just be ponding a little bit more water along those. So, and then the next one we have is the College Avenue project. So there's a vacant lot that's on College Avenue that a stream runs through presently. You can see the drainage area here. It's a little bit about 26 acres, and we can get a small little pond in there to help slow that water back for the folks on College and on Leroy. So you can see creating this impoundment here, which again is in stream, so would still require a dam permit, but it is and a joint permit. But this one here is actually less than an acre. So, and just to give you some of the statistics on these projects, you can see here the 2-year volume that flows to each of those potential projects. So again, O block, the 2-year volume, the 2-year volume that's able to be managed is actually 1.3 million cubic feet. Wait a minute, is that right? I'm sorry. This is the volume that's getting there, and that's the volume that's able to be managed. So it's 1.3 million cubic feet that's coming down the stream. We're able to manage just under 100,000. So it's it's a 10% reduction. That doesn't sound like a lot, but anything that we can do, and we can start to piece these projects together, is going to have an impact. And then for a larger storm, for the 25-year storm, there's 1.9 million cubic feet of water that comes down the stream. and we're able to manage 134,000 cubic feet. I'll go to Center Beach since that one's a little further along. So similarly, there's about 850,000 cubic feet of volume. Our maximum storage is 80,000. And I should clarify that the maximum storage is at the peak of the storm, so we are still slowing water back for the entire event. So again, when you focus on that 10%, don't think that, you know, it's only 10% and that's just a drop in the bucket. You know, it is going to be slowing the water down and stretching that peak out. But again, just limitations due to size. This is what we. Yep.
Explain that about a cubic foot of water. What is that, 6.48 gallons?
7.48.
7.48.
Yes.
So people realize gallons, they may not realize
Sure.
cubic feet, but each cubic foot is 7 gallons of water. So when he's talking 1 million cubic feet, that's 7 million gallons of water.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. So yeah, I often talk in engineering terms, but to relate it, I mean, we're talking about a significant amount of water in all of these watersheds. And you know, due to climate change, you know, that's potentially only going to increase. That's why, you know, we try to do programs for the residents. For those of you that, you know, were aware of the Rain Bell program, everything that property owners can do on their own property then just only helps what's getting into these streams eventually. So, and then just finishing up here, similarly with the 25-year storm at Center Beach, 2.5 million cubic feet, and we're again still able to manage the peak volume at 283,000 cubic feet. So, and you can see some of the stream impacts and wetland impacts that we have at those projects, which also, you know, as I mentioned, are reasons for the joint permit. And then some other stormwater projects. These are really more kind of routine in terms of their infrastructure projects. East Oakmont, Holiday Park phases 2 and 3, general inlet maintenance and repair, and then other stormwater upgrades. So, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the pipes that were installed in the borough are now 50 or 60 years old and are 30 or 40 years past their anticipated lifespan, and they're starting to fail. So, in some cases, we're reacting to those failures. In other cases, we're being proactive. So, many people are aware of the Malabar Culvert, Malabar Road Culvert, which Malabar Road is closed since April. You know, that was a situation where that road was going to collapse. There was an imminent structural failure of that system due to its age. The decision was made to close the road because of that safety issue, and we're working through the permits. That project just went out to bid last week, and I think bids will be due here, I think, August 2nd. So that project will start in August, and we're hoping that that'll be completed. But again, in other cases, we're going out and TVing sections of pipe just to see, and be able to prioritize which projects are going to be implemented next. So certainly Mike can answer a lot of those questions, but as the members of the task force said, I think a lot of them were surprised to understand how much work gets done behind the scenes that most people aren't aware of. So it's and particularly with the stormwater maintenance, those are things that the borough has been doing for years that, again, has largely gone unnoticed. So there you go. So now I'll hand it over to Mike.
Okay, before we have Mike Thomas start with his topic on the agenda, any questions for Tyson on the long-term projects, or any questions you might have on the details associated with the engineering aspects of the projects?
Yeah. On the old block, since you're putting new houses up on the old Junction Farm, where's all that water going to come? Is that going to be taken care of? Because there's a lot of water that comes down through that valley there.
Sure. So as I mentioned, any new development is required to have stormwater management. So there are multiple ponds that are within the Parkside Estates development. But then ultimately, yes, that drainage area would get down to this pond as well as a secondary, management. But in theory, again, all new developments are going to be designed to be equal to or better than the quote-unquote existing condition, at least as the calculations are done today.
Will they have more than one retention pond coming down?
I didn't review those plans, so I don't know. I think there are several, yeah.
Yeah, one of the items that the task force is closely looking at is new developments and their impact on the community at large with respect to stormwater. And how do we hold these developers accountable for ensuring that they put the appropriate stormwater management systems in place, which has been done in the past, but making sure that we, and Mike's going to talk about this when we go over the retention pond review, but making sure the appropriate accountability is placed on the owners of those retention ponds. Because if they're not managed and maintained in accordance with things like MS4, then you ultimately can run into issues. And that's kind of a great transition into the topic that Mike's going to cover.
One other thing I want to say about that is that, you also need to be aware that it's not just big developments, it's actually new single-family homes. So we get a lot of, Mike and his staff get a lot of complaints of, why do I have to do stormwater management for my new house? That's the rules, and unfortunately, you have to start somewhere. While in some cases that can be onerous for those individual homeowners to put stormwater management in, again, we have to start somewhere, or else we just keep contributing and snowballing that problem. Was there another question?
Yeah, about, everyone knows I live on Anderson, and the center beach, is that gonna give me any relief?
Yeah, again, since that's upstream of your watershed, I do believe so,
Okay.
Yes, I mean.
Okay, because I
Yeah.
I know this other Anderson,
Mhm.
and I don't even know what those weirs, I don't even know is that those little dams, what you're talking about?
Correct.
Dams into the ponds?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, but yes, again, theory, both rate and volume will be managed by Center Beach, which would have an effect on Anderson.
Okay, thank you.
Anderson is part of the Plum Creek watershed. That watershed drains about 2/3 of this borough.
Well, believe me,
If you follow that creek back and all the
Doesn't
drainage
surprise
coming off
me.
that creek,
Yes.
it's
that?
bad, and
Yes.
it drains
Yeah,
an immense
I have it
amount
on
of
too.
water.
It's a
So
stunning
that's why you
amount
have
of
the
water.
problems. And like you
the
said,
right.
they're working on the upstream
Yep.
fingers, trying to catch a little here, a little here,
Right.
and then eventually that'll lessen your load. And then finally you'll make it down to where they can do something down in your area, but space is limited. That's a developed area.
Right.
And that's another issue they have.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of woods, I know what
Finding
you're saying,
places
you
to
wouldn't
put
make
these
that public.
things,
That wouldn't be public, obviously, because I know where you're talking about, the woods back there. There's a lot of woods back there.
The deer need a place to hang out.
Pardon me?
I said the deer need a place to hang
They
out.
have plenty of room up north. None of them are up there when you go hunting, they're all down here.
That's true.
All right, thank you, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Mike Thomas for the topic on retention ponds.
Okay. So, and I know this is a very contentious issue and not just in Plum, in many areas, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about these retention ponds. There's the whole technical aspect of the ponds, what they're intended to do, what they're not intended to do, how they're designed, what regulations permit us to do with respect to land development and new housing developments or commercial developments for that matter. But with respect to the existing ponds, for a number of reasons, which I guess we really don't need to go into in great detail, but as Tyson alluded to earlier in his presentation, 77% of the, almost 80% of the homes in Plum were built prior to the implementation of any stormwater management controls or regulations in Plum. And that's not uncommon for Western Pennsylvania, by the way, or for most of Pennsylvania, quite honestly. The problem that we have as a result of that with those ponds is that we have a significant number of ponds that fall into what, sort of this no man's zone. Many ponds in some of the older communities, and when I say older communities, I guess I'm talking about those communities that were developed in the 90s and early 2000s. So I'm not talking about Regency and Garlow and Renton. I'm talking about Rockland and Briarwood and Rustic Ridge and the Highlands, believe it or not. I know everybody thinks about the Highlands as a new development, but that started in 2005. That's when that design started for that plan. So the end result is most of the ponds that we have in Plum, so you have these older communities in Plum that don't have ponds for the most part, but then the majority of the ponds that we do have in Plum fall into that middle area there. They're more than 20 years old. The problems that we have with that are many and varied. The first problem that we have with those ponds is that the regulations and the technology and the approach to stormwater management back then is different, and it was different than it is now, and it's probably not as sophisticated or effective, I guess I would say, as we are now. The other problem is what people don't understand about these housing developments, and this is a huge problem all over Pennsylvania. Housing developers, when a land developer comes in and purchases property, what they tend to do, so you have, ABC Corporation, and they come in and they want to do a housing plan, Frankstown Acres, we'll call it. They create a separate entity that is typically an LLC, a limited liability corporation. They do that for a very specific reason. They don't want to operate as their ABC Corporation, because if there's ever any problems down the road, that's the entity that somebody would go after. So what they typically do, not all the time, but most times, they'll create this LLC, and then when the project is done from their perspective, most developers actually aren't home builders, they just do the land. That's not true in all cases. Graysinger does both, there's a few, but once they sell the lots, they're done, and they dissolve the LLC. So there's no longer a legal entity in many cases to pursue when there's problems, and specifically when there's problems with retention ponds. So you have ABC Corporation that does a housing plan in Plum, like I said, I'll just call it a fictitious one, we do actually have Frankstown Acres, sorry. We'll just call it Frank's Acres. They subdivide 90 lots off, they sell those lots off to a home builder, and once all those lots are sold, they're done and they dissolve the LLC. So now when I have a problem with a retention pond that was built with Frank's Acres Corporation, it doesn't exist anymore. There's nobody for me to go after to say, you need to fix this. So that is probably the biggest problem we have with many retention ponds. Of all the retention ponds that we have in Plum, most fit in that category. We have a number that are commercial entities, and obviously the commercial entities are still there. The retention pond outside the Frito-Lay distribution facility is their pond. The Frito-Lay is still there, and they maintain it, they own it, they're responsible for it. But the problem that we have with these ponds is typically those residential ponds that I just mentioned. So in addition to the fact that the ownership about who's responsible, who owns those ponds, is very frustrating and problematic, the other problem that we have is, since they've stepped away, they're not taking care of it either. So they're not maintaining it. They're not making sure the outflow devices are working properly and it's retaining the water that it's supposed to. They're not maintaining the pond and removing sedimentation and silt, so that a pond that's designed to hold X amount of water, once it starts to fill up with other dirt and silt, that decreases the volume that it can actually hold during a storm. Some of the other problems, some of these ponds were never maintained. Once they were built and constructed years ago, this is all prior to MS4, prior to all these other issues. Thank you. They were never maintained. Once they were approved to construct, and maybe I should back up just very briefly. When a housing developer or anybody proposes to do a pond, the pond itself, the design itself, the location, the landscaping around it, if there's fencing around it, all those things are part of our land development process. But the approval for the pond, the technical approval is not the borough, it's the state. So the state actually issues, just like Tyson was mentioning earlier with our ponds, the state issues those permits. We don't regulate the issue of the permit, the issuance of the permit. The other problem with some of these ponds is many years ago, I guess when I'm saying many, I'm saying the 90s and early 2000s, part of the land development process, the borough at that time really wasn't on top of making sure that these ponds were put in strategically accessible locations. So we have ponds that aren't very accessible for us to even get to, if we could get to them. And something else that wasn't done back then was many of these ponds do not have dedicated rights-of-way to the borough for us to legally get to them. I can't just go through your yard with a backhoe and an excavator and a big, triaxle. I have to have some legal ability to do that. And in some of these cases, in these ponds, we have a pond that's a landlocked parcel that's dedicated to an entity that no longer exists, and we don't have the legal right-of-way to get into it, to fix it, or to maintain it. What we have done since then, though, as we've taken up this issue, is we've inspected every single pond in the borough. And when I say pond, there's an asterisk after the word pond there, and I'll explain later. It's not just ponds, it's something else called BMPs as well. So we've inspected every single pond physically. Staff has been out there, multiple staff members have been out there. We've identified any deficiencies, any need for repairs or improvements that should be made, because sometimes, you know, newer outflow restrictors can be added to further reduce discharge. We've geolocated and mapped everything in our system. We have a GIS, a geographic information system, that enables us to do, it's a very powerful tool. It enables us to do a lot of things in real time. But in order to do that, to put these ponds and all the outflow structures and everything into our system, all that information has to be geolocated with special equipment so that it can be then put into our system. So when I go into our GIS, I can look at the pond at any given on O block, and it tells me all the information on that pond. It's a 15-inch discharge pipe going into the pond for the stream, for example. All of that is very important in planning, maintenance, and when we're moving forward with new permits. And we've created a database of all the ponds with a master list of the ponds and all physical and legal attributes of the pond. So to the extent that we can, we've identified who the legal owners are, if there's any right-of-way dedicated to the borough. And so that for those ponds that we need to address, we know where the gaps are that we can fill in. As the final step that was taken, at least in our initial phase for this, was for those ponds that have an entity that we could identify, we've sent correction letters out to all those owners saying, you need to maintain this pond or make the following repairs. And those maintenance items could be something as simple as removing vegetation or removing excess silt and sedimentation in the pond, or it could be something as significant as repairing an outflow structure or restrictor device in the pond itself, which would then reduce flow going into the stream. Those letters have just gone out, and then staff will be following up with each one of those letters to make sure that those things get done as they're identified for the property owners. Thank you. With respect to the ponds themselves, what we've done is we've actually hired an MS4 coordinator. We've hired an engineering firm, and we specifically hired an additional engineering firm just so that we could have somebody, at least from our perspective, their only responsibility in Plum is MS4s. We have and are continuing to have all of our DP, public works staff trained on all of these MS4 requirements. And that process that we went through, that I went through on the other slide, where we went and inspected every program, that's an annual inspection program that we've developed. That doesn't mean that we're only going to inspect the ponds annually. It just means that that's a program that we're going to do every year. Ponds will be inspected more than once and on an as-needed basis. For example, if somebody were to, notify us of a problem with a pond. The only other thing I wanted to point out on that was that ponds, in quotations, doesn't just mean a retention pond, a hole in the earth that's made to hold water. There are other BMPs that we inspected as well. So, and some of the things that, for example, Mary Wilson from the Cooperative Extension will talk about from the homeowner perspective, we have some other BMPs in the borough as well. All of those things were maintained, or were inspected. So when I tell you that we inspected 65 ponds, we did, but there were many other structures, smaller structures, probably in the neighborhood of almost 30, that were also inspected as well. And those smaller BMPs are also designed to reduce discharge rates, to improve water quality. So as I said, there's 65 ponds that we've identified in the borough, and those are ponds. Those are actual retention ponds. There's another almost 30 BMPs in addition to that, so we're somewhere around 95 stormwater retention devices in Plum, or structures. Of those ponds, 15 are currently owned by Plum Borough. They're either the ones that the borough themselves constructed and maintained and permitted, or they are some that were dedicated to the borough in some cases. For example, there's a new housing development, Colonial Point, over behind the high school over there off of Ellicott Road. The developer in that case dedicated those ponds to Plum Borough. Part of that dedication process, why that's important to us, is when we work with the developer to have them turn over the ponds, is when they go through the process to construct the pond as part of their land development for their residential development, they propose a design, location design, and all those things, the attributes of the ponds themselves. And then they're constructed. We send out inspectors. Actually, it's Tyson's KU Resources inspectors that go out periodically at certain specific milestone dates in the developments to make sure that it's being constructed according to the approved design. And at the end of this, when they give us when they dedicate it, we get a dedicated right-of-way, so we have access to it, legal right to work in it, and we get something called as-bills, which are very important for us. The problem with some of those other ponds that we talked about is that none of those ponds were ever inspected. These ponds that I mentioned before that were installed in the 90s and early 2000s, none of them were inspected. I have no data on them, and in at least one case, the pond is not built on the parcel that it was supposed to be built on. So there's a housing plan in Plum that was built in the mid-90s. There was a pond that was proposed and approved by the borough to be built on this parcel, and for whatever reason, from my understanding, the borough's knowledge, it was built on the adjacent parcel, which is private property. It was built on the side yard, if you will, of the adjacent house. These are the kind of problems that we don't know where the outflow pipes are because we don't have any as-bills. So a lot of this stuff with these older ponds, it's, we have to have a TV camera go down the line to try and locate them. Thankfully, these new TV cameras have GPS in them, so we can at least map where these pipes are. But again, because a lot of these things were done earlier without proper inspection, without proper approval, and without proper dedication to the borough, we're really chasing our tails to some extent with some of these ponds. Of the 65 ponds in the borough, 42 are privately owned. We can clearly identify 42 privately owned. Most of them are school district, Frito-Lay, your bigger businesses in Plum here, the Davison Road Business Park, for example. But there are 9 ponds that we've identified and one of the ponds that we've identified is that pond that's built on the wrong parcel. And just because because it is on somebody's private property, I'd rather not mention which one it is at this point. But of the ponds that we've identified that we need to clear up, there's one in Briarwood, one in Green Valley, 3 in the Highlands, one in Mark Haven. Mark Haven is the plan behind Wimbledon off of, I call it Monroeville Trestle Road, some people call it Center Road, across from the playground, the county park, the playground there. And one in Meadow Hill Village, one in Rockland Manor, one on Rosewood Drive. And then there's a 10th pond that's on Davison Road. And I've put that on there not because the ownership is unclear. We know very clearly who owns it. However, it's a commercial pond off Davison Road. And over the years, it was a commercial pond that was put in to serve one property, one commercial business location. Over the years, however, somehow, and this is more than 20 years ago now, other businesses have tapped into that pond. So, and they do this without notifying the borough, they do this without getting permission. Whether or not they got permission from that property owner, we don't know, because the property owner that owns it now is not the original property owner that developed it. So now I have a pond in a commercial area that was designed to service one building, if you will, that now has 12 buildings tied into it. So now it's not sufficient to handle the flow, and it's now flooding things downstream. So we are in the process right now of trying to take ownership of that pond so that we can upsize it significantly to be able to handle the flow that's already designed that's already going into it. So that one it's not unclear who owns it. We know exactly who owns it, and we're attempting to obtain ownership of it. But it is just another example of some of the problems that we have with the ponds in Plum Borough. And again, I shouldn't say Plum Borough, because I think this is a big problem all over western PA. And then finally, just so you guys can get an idea of the cost of just this MS4 program that we're looking at implementing over the next 2 years. Because of the requirements for maintenance of these ponds, if we're going to go from 15 ponds to almost to 24 ponds, and because the requirements under MS4 is to maintain the ponds that we already do own has increased significantly. Our 2-year plan, 2 to 5 year plan for the department is to add 5 employees to the Public Works Department to create a division that does nothing but stormwater management and specifically maintaining these ponds. We estimate that we're going to need 4 operators to do this. That's 1 heavy equipment operator and 3 laborers, truck drivers, if you will, as well as 1 foreman. We will have to purchase additional heavy equipment to be able to do this, because the heavy equipment, when heavy equipment, we're talking about backhoes, excavators, skid steers, those kind of things, as well as the dump trucks and triaxles that we use to be able to haul materials in and out of places. That $20,000 just represents an annual lease purchase cost for the equipment that we estimate we'll need to purchase, and that's amortized over 12 years. So our actual expense for year 1 will be more than $20,000, but we've amortized it because we typically get 10 to 12 years out of our capital equipment. We also spend a lot of money on materials and supplies for these ponds, and obviously we have employee overhead, workers' comp insurance, all those employee benefit overhead expenses. And then we have an additional $100,000 annually, that's also an annualized estimate, for additional capital projects that will have to be done for these ponds, because while there's the routine maintenance of these ponds, every once in a while, every few years, these ponds, the outflow structure needs to be replaced, needs to be restricted. There's other things that can and must be done to some of these ponds at times. Won't be every year for each pond, but we're estimating that it's going to be about $100,000 a year on average for the 24 or 25 ponds. So at the end of the day, we're talking about another $700,000 being added to the budget just to manage these ponds. And I just wanted to go back to that slide that Mr. Odom referred to earlier. That $2 million average that we have now, in about 2 years, it's going to be $3 million. Because that $2 million does not include this $700,000. And also, I wanted to point out too, with respect to that if you look at the stormwater average for stormwater project average for 10 years, it's about 8.5% of total expenses. For the 5-year average, it goes up to 10.7%, and that's on the handout that I gave you guys. When you think about that, when we add the additional $700,000 or so for this program, that is going to take it up well above 10%. Stormwater is quickly becoming one of the single fastest growing expenses that we have in Plum Borough. It's a function of a number of things: increased responsibilities, increased natural problems that we're experiencing, and very old and aging infrastructure.
So one of the things that I also wanted to add to the discussion, and I think Mike did a fantastic job going over all the information and the challenges that we have with retention ponds in the borough. But these retention ponds are considered to be what I would consider to be the cornerstone of a good stormwater management program. We have to get this right. To give you some perspective, we've spent the last, 4 task force meetings going over the retention pond issue in the borough, just so you kind of have visibility into what the task force is doing. Mike's talking about all this stuff, but these are all items that we previously discussed amongst the task force to figure out what are we going to do about these retention ponds. We had this 11 by 17 large printout, and we're all going through all this information associated with the excruciating details of these retention ponds, where they are, how they're being managed, which ones are MS4 compliant, which ones have ownership, all of the details, in order to get down to. Oh, Dave Reynolds is showing one of the documents that we went over in one of our meetings about the ponds, and it ultimately resulted in us identifying these 9 ponds that Mike was talking about that had an ownership and could potentially result in a systemic issue in the communities that they serve if they don't get resolved and taken under some type of responsible ownership. And so this is what the task force, one of the things the task force is going to be recommending to council is looking to adopt these 9 retention ponds so that they can get the appropriate management that they need. Now, that being said, I think one of the other items that we have to take into consideration is the cost of this. Because when we first started looking at this problem, one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted to look at it independent of cost. We didn't really, not that we didn't care about cost, but we wanted to factor our decision based on what the need was with respect to the retention ponds that needed management. And then we asked Mike to go off and pull together what the annual program cost would be. And as you can see, it's substantial. So there's no free lunches is kind of what this boils down to. But we on the task force think it's the right thing to do. So we're going to recommend that to council, and hopefully we can put ourselves in a position where we can appropriately allocate the budgetary funds to support the annual program costs that it's going to take to manage these retention ponds. But we wanted to make sure we went over this information during this meeting, since it's something that we've talked about for several task force meetings, and we certainly think this is one of the biggest issues that we need to overcome in order to put ourselves in a better position to effectively do stormwater management in the borough.
Just one other thing,
Yes.
if I might. So just to put this all in perspective with that program cost of $700,000. If you look at that handout that we gave you on the second page there, you'll see that where it identifies the general fund and the expenses from 2010 to 2021. Beginning with 2015, when we implemented the flood mitigation fee, you'll see that we've spent, roughly about, I don't know, just off the top of my head, $800,000 a year on flood mitigation. That correlates to the amount of money that we collect from that $5 a month fee that Tyson and Dave both spoke about. So you can see that this program is almost doubling that cost. Adding this MS4 program in just for these retention ponds is almost doubling that cost. Well, it's not almost doubling it, it's doubling it.
Also, as Mike mentioned before, there are 64 ponds in this borough. Some of these are owned by homeowners associations, but the homeowners don't know they own. And as Mike said, the developer just walks in and basically wipes his hands of it, he's gone. So no one's managing these. And how do you tell people who've been living there 20 years, hey, you have to maintain this pond. You have to maintain this pond, not the borough. So that's why we're looking into what ones can we take over to kind of share the load, and which ones are new enough that these people should be aware and should take care of them themselves. Also, these stream cleanup things that we've done once or twice now, it's so important if you live in one of these areas, you have one of these streams in the back of your property, just go down and check your backyard. We're not asking you to walk 20 miles upstream. We're not asking you to pull trees out. But if you see a limb, or if you see some garbage, or somebody drew by and throw a tire over the hill, as often happens, just take it out and get it out of there. Because when this rain comes, all this stuff floats downstream, and the first time one big piece catches something, that's it. Everything just builds right there. You just built a dam. That poor guy at the end of Key West, that opening under that road is 6 foot by 8 foot. And that thing got plugged and that man got buried. He had 5 feet of water in his garage. At the end of Key West, you wouldn't think that's not deep of an area. But that's just some stuff coming down the street. So if you could just clean up your backyard, we're not asking you to kill yourself. And if it's too big, call the borough. If you have a tree that fell down, notify the borough. And I'm sure they'll try to do their best to get it out of there. But you got to keep that stream clean first of all. It's bad enough you got a ton of water, but as soon as you start building dams, you really got a ton of water. And like there's 64 ponds. It's an ongoing problem. It's been going on for years, and these guys are working. I was surprised how much is actually being done. I mean, I was one of the people that stood at that microphone complaining. That's why I got on this task force. And there's a lot of time and a lot of money spent on this, and there's going to be a lot more time and a lot more money to get it straightened out. But if everybody just pitches in and does a little bit, it would help greatly.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's an excellent point. So I know we're running a little short on time, so I wanted to transition into the next topic on the agenda. Today, I'm happy to announce that we have a representative from the Penn State Cooperative Education Group. Yes?
The Cooperative Extension.
Oh, Cooperative Extension. Thank you. Miss Mary Wilson is here to present information on a stormwater educational topic and best management practices. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Mary, and she will conduct her presentation.
I feel as though. Thank you very much. I'm going to stand behind you, and I apologize for that. But I feel as though I have a lot less to say because each one of you have mentioned things that I'm going to be touching on. And so this is kind of right up our alley, or right up our stream, so to speak. And I'm going to be reiterating and reinforcing a number of points that were made here, but also maybe shedding some light on a bit about the topography of Western Pennsylvania that might help to bring this into perspective. Yep. Oh, yep, thanks. One of the things that I wanted to do as well is just to introduce you to the extension program and Penn State as an extension program host university. Penn State is a land-grant university, and there is a network of land-grant universities around the country that were established years and years and years ago to provide research into agriculture. And the idea of the extension program, in a really brief summary, is to share the information from the research done at those universities with the public. And this is not just agriculture anymore. Now it's expanded to everything, including waterways, watersheds, the Master Gardener program you're familiar with. So the program that I coordinate is the equivalent of the Master Gardener program, but it's about watersheds. So I am the coordinator of the Master Watershed Steward program for Allegheny County. We have programs in an expanding number of counties throughout the state. We are only a young program, having started in 2013 in Eastern PA because of the Chesapeake issues. We started in Western PA in Allegheny County in 2016. I came on board in 2019, and we are now at the point of having nearly 40 volunteers active in our program, and they do outreach, education, and also hands-on stewardship. So if you would like some help with riparian buffer plantings, we're here for you. So just briefly, that was the summary of extension, basically serving as an education outreach program for the university, both in agriculture and other fields. We're science-based, and so that's the key. We're based on research and science. This is the program that I mentioned we manage in terms of the Master Watershed Steward program. I don't need to tell you all what a watershed is, but you would be surprised by the number of people that don't know what a watershed is. A lot of people think it's a shed that holds water. And so that's not surprising. They also think it might just be the stream, but they don't realize it's the land that drains to an endpoint, and that is defined on different scales, right? So it could be the Mississippi watershed, which drains literally a third of our country, or it could be the Ohio River Basin watershed, to which we all contribute, or it could be your local county, the local watershed in Allegheny County. What's interesting about water is it doesn't recognize political boundaries. We wish it would, right? We wish there were customs gates at the entry of each of our municipalities, but it doesn't work that way. So we think in terms of watershed. So a number of my points are going to be focusing on watershed, not necessarily the Plum Creek Borough. or Plum Borough, I'm sorry. You can tell my language is around the creek, right? So, so this is the Plum Creek watershed. And this map was derived from a really fascinating computer tool that I think everybody should know about called Model My Watershed. It's a wiki watershed production. And it is an extremely valuable tool because what you do is you put a dot on the map for where you want to know the watershed draining into that area. It will calculate a number of statistics for you and draw that boundary. Very helpful little tool, isn't that cool? So this is a distortion of that, basically flipped on end, or on its side. So this is Plum Creek watershed. What does that remind you of? What does that pattern of landforms remind you of? A tree, yay. It is a dendritic drainage pattern. Dendrology is the study of trees, and that dendritic drainage pattern has that structure that resembles a tree. That's really important here because there's a neat little factoid about dendritic systems. When we're talking about streams, and this is language that I know that Tyler probably thinks about in his sleep, we think in terms of the order of streams. This is a very nice system of identifying where you are in the hierarchy of those streams. So if it's a first order stream, it's one of those tiny little streamlets or rivulets or just a tiny little even depression in the back of somebody's yard they don't even realize will hold water when it rains. It can be a temporary channel or a fully running channel, but it's the smallest headwater stream in the system. Second order, you have to have 2 first order streams to make a second order stream and on down the line, okay? So let's look at Plum Creek. I'm gonna go back to the local, back. Where do we go back? Yep, sorry. There, yeah, forward. One more. There, okay. I don't like tables and I don't like numbers, but these numbers mean something to me. This is really, really important stuff. The table here is showing, and this was again produced by Model My Watershed. This is telling you how many miles of stream in the Plum Creek watershed are those tiny little first order streams, second order streams, or third order streams. So I apologize. So how many are in the first order group? Can anybody? I'm not sure. Can you all read that? You probably might not be able to. 30.43 miles of stream in the Plum Creek watershed are first order streams. Only 5 are second order. And the third order stream, which is the main trunk, is only 11. And I bring this to your attention because it reinforces all the statements that have been made about the need for thinking upstream, thinking about what's happening on where the raindrop falls. And what's an interesting byproduct of this is that in these dendritic stream systems, 65 to 85% of the land mass within that watershed drain to the first order streams. The very vast majority of the land in a watershed drains to those first order streams. So that's why it's very, very important to us to have homeowners, property owners, park managers, whoever is in that first order stream property zone, understand that they are the first line of attack for managing rainwater or snowmelt, whichever you're thinking of. So in this configuration for Plum Creek, 63 plus odd % of the streams are in the first order ranking. So with that as our framework, let's think in terms of what can be done on those first order streams. What can be done on the individual properties that reside along those small streams? And remember, these can be channels that are dry part of the year, but they are still critical because when they do hold water, they are probably going to take anything that might have been put there in the way of leaf piles or grass clippings or anything. They're going to move it downhill because water goes downhill. Funny thing that. This is the other consideration in terms of local watersheds. we have so much impervious surface in the construction of roadways and driveways and rooftops and all of that kind of thing. This is a graphic representation of what you are trying to tackle. It's basically that first flush, that peak flow that's coming down from a rain event. In nature, the woods and the grassy areas put the brakes on that. And so the terminology you're going to see in a minute is very, I'm repeating the terminology used earlier. Flow and volume are considerably different in terms of how they move through the system. So you're tackling the fact that that peak is moved to the earlier time frame, and it's higher because of all the water coming off those hard surfaces. So one of our goals is to not have people lose their property to scouring and erosion by using poor land use practices on their property. This is a property, it's it's a private business property. There should be no evidence of erosion on a property like that. That's a small swale. It should be a small, shallow swale. But because it was mowed to the edge, the grass is not holding the soil in place, and it's being permitted to scour out. And we'll talk about a variety of ways to address that. But one of the benefits of thinking in terms of these BMPs is that it actually protects your property. It keeps the property where it is rather than having it run down the stream as an eroded cubic foot of soil. So some of the things you can do, again, we're talking about rate and volume. Reduce volume, reduce speed, protect the stream edges. I'll have some more on that in a minute. And also keep it clean. And so I'm going to just kind of go through a number of ideas here. I'm not covering all of them, and a number of them are redundant to things that have been said already, but I know you're aware of the rain barrels because I know you've had a rain barrel workshop. I would suggest if you have a rain barrel that you raise it up so you get better head pressure and are able to use it for watering your garden better. Not vegetable garden preferably, but any other landscaping. And then this is one of the things about changing the volume as well. People assume, and we know what assume means, but people assume that because they have green lawns, they are promoting infiltration. Lawns don't infiltrate water worth mentioning because we run lawnmowers over them, we drive tractors over them. We compress that soil so severely that it only absorbs about 45% of the water at the most on average that hits it. So in terms of its comparison to a forested system, forests absorb many more inches per hour than lawn. Lawn is almost virtually like pavement, as you can see here. So because it's green doesn't mean it's doing anything for you. And that is one of the reasons that area where you saw the scouring happening was getting eroded. Shallow roots do not make for good infiltration. This is first of 2 points to raise about forests. Western Pennsylvania and all of the Northeast U.S. is generously forested, or was at one point. Remember that forests are your best friend in this issue because, for instance, one oak tree of 24-inch diameter can absorb 11,000 gallons of water a year. That's one tree. So if you think in terms of forested canopy on hillsides, you do not want to be cutting those trees down. Not only do you not want to do it because you don't want the hillside sliding downhill onto somebody's backyard, but they are doing work for you. They are saving you nightmares. So that's something to consider for property owners as well. If you see those big, vast areas of grass, maybe something to consider is, can they improve water infiltration and absorption on their property with trees? Trees not only absorb the property and don't release it back into the ground slowly, they put it into the atmosphere as water vapor. So they take the water out of the system entirely until it's recirculated through rain, probably somewhere else. So forests are very, very valuable. They are so valuable that the city of New York recognized that forested lands were able to clean their drinking water more effectively at almost no cost in the Catskills, to the extent that they were going to save over $3 billion, and this is quite a while ago, they were going to save $3 billion in developing a filtering system for their water if they just bought acreage in the Catskills. So what do you think they did? They bought the acreage in the Catskills. It's doing a better job, and it's a much less cost, and they didn't have several $100 million in annual expenses as a result. So trees really, really are your friend. If they are near a house, they need to be appropriately scaled. I recognize all of that. You have to deal with maintenance, but in stormwater issues, they really are beneficial. So one of the things that homeowners can consider doing is to plant trees and shrubs to help absorb some of that water. Of course, we want to keep them away from old pipes. We want to keep them away from structures, but there are ways usually where you can enhance property by having additional vertical storage of stormwater in the form of trees. People can create a miniature meadow. It doesn't need to be a big swath of land. It can be something fairly small, even just along the side of a house. And the reason that this is valuable is that these plants have roots that go beyond 4 inches deep. Grass doesn't absorb much water. These plants not only have deeper roots to absorb the water at deeper depths, they also break up the soil at those deeper depths, and that helps the water infiltrate more effectively. So meadows are actually a very good strategy for helping in water infiltration. In some of the county parks, you might now see meadow plantings to help contribute to that process. If they're in areas that aren't getting a lot of foot traffic or in a balls playing zone, this is actually an incredibly quickly growing strategy for stormwater management. Just go back to natural vegetation. I expect you all have been talking about rain gardens over the years. This is another strategy where a rain garden is actually a somewhat engineered approach to creating a depression on your land to put plantings that will help absorb that water that's being held temporarily under the roots. It's not meant to hold water. It's not a detention it's not a retention pond. Really, it's a detention pond, short term. But the plants, again, are doing the job of absorbing the water and distributing it out to the air as water vapor. And there are all sorts of tips about how to build them. The Rain Garden Alliance is, it was co-started locally, and the person who is the best resource for that is Roxanne Swan at the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania. She is a gem to have in our area. She can tell you everything you need to know about rain gardens, and their website is brilliant. It will help you calculate what you need to build. This is another thing. We're talking about protecting the stream edges. I can't overemphasize the importance of these riparian buffers. Riparian buffers hold the soil in place. They keep that erosion process from happening. This is a planted riparian buffer. You can see the tree tubes kind of scattered in the background. That's kind of a mixed strategy where they didn't mow, but then they supplemented that with the trees. Trees, again, reinforcing that concept of trees are really, really valuable. And then the other thing is to just establish an area along the stream that is not mowed. Don't do what the people in that earlier slide did where they mow right to the edge. Allow a no-mow zone area to allow those deeper rooted plants to get established. This is a point that was made about keep it clean. Keeping it clean is vital. This is a really bad example of encroachment on the stream corridor and the so-called floodplain of the stream. It's not even recognizable as a floodplain right now. This is never an advisable strategy. These people are going to be losing every piece of property they have on the ground at that stream side with a significant flush. So that is never advisable. If people store firewood back there, they need to move it away from the stream's edge. If they have any kind of shed, I would even consider having that moved away from the stream's edge, and I will show you why in a minute. But this is especially dangerous. For instance, if people have something like gasoline containers in their shed and it gets wiped out by a heavy rain event, then you have significant pollution being introduced into the water. But when people put their limbs or their leaf collection or lawn cuttings in a setting like this, it will go downstream. It's just a matter of time. And that's not going to be helpful to anybody, so I'm glad you had made that point. Oh, sorry. I need to back up again. Oh, sorry. This isn't going backward. Yeah, next. Thank you. Okay. So this is a true story about stormwater. Who was in town in 2004? Okay, everybody remembers Ivan, I'm sure, right? Yeah, Ivan. Yeah. I lived in the Pine Creek Watershed at that time. And so this is a nice little section of the Pine Creek. Not quite in line with this next picture, but not too different. During Ivan, a stream like that turned into that. And that's not that's a real picture. That's from the flood dam at North Park Lake. So if that person has a shed in their backyard along a stream, even something as minimal as that little stream below will turn into a raging torrent like this. And a picnic table from North Park ended up down in Shaler 3 miles downstream. So that's it. This is not a joke. This is not a falsehood. This is a true story. You need to get things away from the stream's edge to protect your own property and the people downstream. No. There. All right, so then this is the other point. I know this is probably in the BMPs because maintaining storm grates is one of the classic BMPs for MS4. There is actually a group locally who is promoting that private citizens participate in this process and help the municipalities along. Allegheny Cleanways is now has started a program called the Grate Keepers, where you go online and you register for which grates you actually want to maintain on a regular basis, and you report how much cleaning you do of those grates. Can you imagine if everybody adopted the grates on their little local street, how valuable that would be and how much money it would save? The municipality would love you. So promoting this in a newsletter or something like that would be a really great tool. And so I wanted to bring that to your attention. It took them a little while to get the website going, and I think they're going to tweak it, but it's still a really good program. And then the other thing is to recognize people who do go above and beyond in terms of managing property. The Master Watershed Steward program in Pennsylvania and the Nature Center in Eastern PA got together to do something similar to what Audubon Society has done in terms of landscaping for birds and that kind of thing, but this is for watershed protection. And so in promoting infiltration, doing all of those things that we just talked about. And so there is a certification program for property owners who meet a certain number of items on a checklist of BMPs for property owners to help promote infiltration and keep streams healthy. So, so that is a resource that I was hoping to have flyers on. They are stuck halfway from eastern Pennsylvania to here, but I will have some, and I'll be happy to get those to you. But I'd also be happy to do a program for your residents about that program as well, because I think it's a really fun, creative twist on having everybody in the watershed involved. So any questions? That's my email if anyone is interested, and there is literature. Yeah, so.
This is just an anecdotal question I had happened to me at a house I owned a couple of years ago. It was a pretty urban area, and I had a backyard, and quite honestly, I just didn't want to mow it. And I got a violation from the borough to say, your grass is more than 6 inches tall. Of course, being a savvy engineer, I told them, well, that's because it's stormwater management. But how do you, is that something that the Cooperative Extension does, or that outreach to how do you convince people to change zoning requirements, or code enforcement officers to say, can we relax this, or particularly backyards, front yards, people might not ever get there, but the balance between having a natural meadow versus having a well-maintained line.
It's a really good question. I can tell you as someone who joined my community's EAC for a number of years, Environmental Advisory Council, that being involved in councils like this is the most informative process you can be involved in. But it also gives you a chance to have be engaged in the conversation around things along those lines. The other part of that is that you can do it, for instance, in each of those images that I showed you, I don't think you would have complained about a neighbor having a site like that, because they looked as though the property, yeah, right. If they're maintained as a section within a groomed space, I encourage people to make sure that there are either pathways mowed through them or a boundary of mowed space around them, so it is clear that they are not a neglected site. They are a managed site. Also putting out a site, you can put a sign up indicating, for instance, that it might be a pollinator garden landscape, something that is designed to enhance the benefit of life for the community as a whole. Having it just look neglected is something that I think most community members would say is not a direction you want to go. You need to make sure that it looks intentional. And if you do it through selected plantings, you can be a bit more strategic in how you organize it. Having it as a no-mow zone can be a challenge, but if it's along a riparian buffer, this is something in terms of municipal programming, sometimes, and more, we are promoting the protection of the riparian buffer as aggressively as possible because, and several different reasons. That is the last line of defense for infiltration and sediment removal for water coming off land toward a stream. So, and it usually has deep-rooted plants that will be very effective at that water infiltration and very effective at catching sediment.
I have a two-part question. Are pine trees as absorbent as deciduous trees?
I love that you asked that question. They're more absorbent because they're active year-round. And I think everybody that I know that has seen the statistics on that has been stymied by it. If there is an oak tree, for instance, that would absorb 4,000 gallons a year, a pine tree would absorb 11,000.
Well, we've talked about planting programs, and my concern was always the leaves, because I've had to go out on the street myself and drag leaves off the grate.
Right.
Because it was long.
Right.
And I was always concerned with deciduous trees if we were going to start a planting program, and that's why I wanted to know if the pines, so the pines are actually better at.
Pines are better at.
Less leaves and stuff to deal with that.
Exactly right, yeah. Any evergreen. Unfortunately, there are a number of evergreen species that are dealing with insects or some other disease, and this is a challenge on all trees at this point. Environmental issues have kind of created stress on different species, but pine trees in particular are something that are very effective in terms of water absorption and dispersal through water vapor, yeah.
But sometimes when they're right on the stream edge, pine trees don't allow grass to grow underneath them like deciduous trees do, which actually can cause a problem.
Which is
Right.
with the problem we
Right.
have along your stretch
Right.
there.
Well,
So-
and the right tree in the right place. Pines are not meant for moist environments anyway. So it's really, really key. So on a moist environment setting like that, something like a willow shrub is really key. And the other factor, people think in terms of the risk to property by having trees, even near a stream. Having this, you'd mentioned having the tree fall across the stream and create a dam. That is a legitimate concern, but not all trees across streams are necessarily a bad thing. You have to kind of look at it case by case. If it's high enough, so if the stream is down there and the tree is up here, it might just be a helpful highway for wildlife going back and forth, but not a risk of creating a dam. So I do encourage people to take a look at each each tree fall across a stream very individually.
So just so we have some sort of, just because you've touched on a couple of things, this Great Keeper program sounds very interesting. We actually are finishing up, we have over 3,000 catch basins, Grates and Plum, but we actually are physically inspecting, photographing, and geolocating every single one of them. Mm-hmm. We're about 2/3 of the way done with that, so that might be something we would be able to do, because we can identify exactly where the catch basins are. We have a database of them. They're actually in our GIS. The other thing is we do, just so everybody's aware, we only require the first 50 feet of your property, your street front, to be mowed. We don't, if your grass in your backyard is too high, that doesn't stop the neighbors from telling on one another. But our ordinance only requires the first 50 feet of your property from the street edge to be mowed. And even in some of those cases, for example, like where it doesn't make sense to mow it, we've sort of encouraged it to be maintained naturally.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about what you're saying about the trees near the streams. My creek is, across the street is a church. And when the new father came, there was some kind of trees, I don't know what kind they were, but they were trees. And I truly think that has worsened my situation. The erosion in the creek, he tore all the trees out. So it's nothing but grass, and it is mowed right to the edge. And the erosion in the creek, if anybody, I probably have pictures myself of the change, I guess, would that be topography, of the shape and the erosion, how the banks are caving in. And I do believe that is a contributing factor that makes so much sense what you're saying about the trees.
Roots hold dirt.
Yeah.
Bottom line. And when you see places where trees or any vegetation has been removed from a stream bank and they've had to armor it, it's called armoring, whether you do a concrete shield or riprap cages, which are the fenced stones captured in fence boxes. All of those are really temporary systems that, like any other infrastructure, are going to last 30 years if you're lucky. The concrete gets broken up because water gets behind it and cracks it. The gabion baskets tend to be rusted eventually over time because they get bumped and scratched and the steel doesn't hold up. Any of those man-made engineering structures, and this is in most cases, not all cases. I will say there are places where a quote-unquote engineered approach are the most suitable. But when you see that that's been done in a place where it really could have been prevented by having proper vegetation management in that floodplain and riparian buffer area, it's going to cause problems like exactly what you're describing. It is really key to try and keep the soil there through the natural engineering of roots, because they are 3, 4, 5 feet deep and holding that soil there through a network, not just at the very shallow edges of the stream.
And they weren't pretty, but I mean, I do think it helped the
Right.
situation.
Yes.
But now they're gone.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. One of the things that we are doing as a program is promoting vegetation of stream edges by the development of the use of live stakes. And live stakes are basically cuttings of very water-loving plants like willows and things like that, that will be, if you just put those live stakes into the ground in a proper protocol, they will set out roots on their own. And it's a very cost-effective, labor-effective way of establishing a riparian buffer and securing those stream banks against erosion system. We're going to be doing workshops about it. So if you'd like to have us line up a workshop about that, we'd be delighted to do that. So, yeah, and it's the most cost-effective way to secure a stream bank possible, and that applies especially in the first order and second order streams.
So one of the things that I was noting, and I wanted to point out too, that the map that you put up was just the portion of Plum that's in the Plum Creek watershed. We also have the Puckett Creek watershed as well.
Yep.
So, I'm looking at the number of, if I remember correctly, it was somewhere upwards of 50 miles of 50 miles of stream, which means there's 50 miles worth of property owners on either side of that stream.
That wasn't kilometers.
Oh, it was in kilometers? Oh,
Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
oh,
Yeah.
still significant amount of space.
Yeah,
And it's
I'm
only,
sorry.
and it's
Yeah.
only the one watershed.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's my point is, for people to understand, there's a significant number of properties in Plum that are impacted by this and are impacting the stream system. This is not just, 5% of the homes in Plum. This is a very pervasive problem in Plum.
The 15% of people that live right on the stream that get the most damage, but it's the 75% of the other people that could help. And,
Yes.
Just as a side, like, I was doing a development in Pine Town, during McCandless Township, right on Pine Creek, and all the neighbors came out, you got to fix the stormwater, tell them, well, you're the problem. I'm not, this development's not the problem. Your yard's the problem, and all your neighbor's yards are the problem, but that's difficult to get that point across.
That's why we're here.
Dave, is this gonna be broadcast, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, we're gonna put it up on YouTube.
There's so few of you here, and I know you're in a real hotbed of flooding areas, I'm sure the other two are, and they will be here. Talk to your neighbors, have them watch this film, so they get this information. And it'll answer some questions for them, because I know being on this task force has answered a lot of questions for me.
Well, it's very enlightening, as it is.
So, yeah, please tell your neighbors to watch this, and maybe they couldn't come, I understand, but have them watch it, see what's going on.
How do we, as a community, get the information out there, get people involved? You know, how do we go about it?
We make, our whole intent in being here is to help educate. If you'd like to schedule workshops on a monthly basis on any number of these topics, we'd be happy to share that with you. If you'd like to have us go from community to community to community, we'd be happy to help. That's why we're here. So if we can do anything, if you want something for your newsletter, we can help to develop literature for you. We can direct people to the resources that are already existing on the Penn State website. The extension website has oodles and oodles and oodles of resources. There are webinars about these different strategies that are on a regular basis. So we can make this information available to you through a number of different ways.
So I realize I'm putting you under the gun here, but Tuesday, so we have a quarterly magazine that we put out each year. It's those in-community magazines, if you've seen them. We usually purchase 6 to 8 pages in every quarterly issue. I have to have it to the editor by Tuesday, so I know but if it's possible, if the extension had like just sort of a half page or quarter page ad that could at least, that we could get in there, I mean, we'd be happy to do that. We can get it to, I know it's, you gotta get it.
I have one I'm developing. The funny thing that you ask, because I have an article I am developing for Monday about something called streamscaping, which is a compromise strategy for those people who like to mow to the edge of their stream, but they like that manicured aesthetic, which is all well and good, except it creates erosion, right? So we've developed a process, a landscaping process basically called streamscaping, and the concept there is that you have a nicely planned, attractive landscape area, but it's along that stream channel. So you get the best benefit of having something appealing to look at. You can create windows in it so that you can see that stream that's now probably 3 feet down in a canyon, but you can still see the channel. But it gives you that sense of clean, managed property. So I can at least start you out with that.
Yeah, that would be great. Any things that we could put please check out this website. We'll be happy to put it in.
Happy to add that to it. Yeah, thanks. And
Yeah, I like your idea about cleaning up the stream. I only have one issue, is I wouldn't mind volunteering to do the stream near my house, but I have a neighbor, anytime I walk over here to clean something up, I'm getting a police call. So if I could have a letter or something saying I'm allowed to clean this up, that would be great, because I don't need somebody coming down on me.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can't give you a letter to go on someone else's property,
But
so.
it's your easement. Your easement comes up here, so my understanding, anybody can go on that easement, right?
No.
The stream does not,
The stream is not, no, there's no easement.
So
Like
then
a
I can't
like a
go-
stormwater pond might, but the stream itself does not. That's water to the Commonwealth.
So I can't go and clean that up.
Well, you could if the property owner adjacent to that area of the stream would permit you, but if they don't, there's not much, I mean,
Right.
the municipality can't grant you access to someone else's property.
I
Okay.
mean, why would he oppose you removing stuff from the street?
There's just certain people that are nasty, different things.
Yeah.
We talked about it at the task force, Mike had brought it up, having like a cleanup day, that the residents get out there. And I think it'd be a great way to, get the education process going, get the volunteers, just go in, clean up the street, the creeks and streams. Hoping, Mike had brought it up, that we can maybe get that ball rolling as well. I recommend doing it like in the fall because of the amount of snakes in the creek. Either it'll go away.
Yeah, we talked about, we have the
cleanup day in April, which kind of coincides with Earth Day, and then, maybe do a stream cleanup, just specifically streams, sometime in the fall, so, to other communities.
And you can let residents know ahead of time, hey, if you see somebody out there, this is what we're doing.
If you have certain people who won't do anything because it doesn't affect their property because they're up here, but even though their property goes down there, they don't do anything.
Is there a way to, like, I live on Pine Valley Creek, and Mike and Tyson walked down the one day, and they're, hey, you got grass clippings here, and, they noticed my neighbor's pine trees. But, like, when I moved in, the previous owner had put riprap, like a block, they call it, on the bank. So when Ivan and Francis, remember Francis too, Francis
Right,
was
before
before Ivan.
That's why Ivan was listed that.
It really eroded, took away part of my property behind my shed. My neighbor had a fence, and probably, I would say 6 foot, he had his fence and then 6 foot of grass and then a creek. Well, Ivan and Francis came, took all that away, right up against his fence. I didn't understand, how to keep the banks, in place, other than, yeah, this riprap, that's doing the job. So when Ivan and Francis came through, I put more of it so I wouldn't lose my shed. But now, hey, my shed really shouldn't be there. So, but, like, my neighbors, I have cleaned up my area, but my neighbors, they're still in the habit of doing what we shouldn't be doing. I think it's so important that there is some type of, letter sent out, or just the visual of people going in there and working and doing it, and somebody comes out, what are you doing? This is what we're doing. And I think, the success of the rain barrel program, I think why it was a success is because it was hands-on. They were getting something. Putting in a meadow by the creek or planting, I think it'll be a bigger impact if we can actually do it, other than sitting here watching, a presentation.
Along those lines, you were talking about developing the park-type property. I know that there are other parks within the borough. If you can think of sites where having a riparian buffer planting, whether it's a live stake planting or shrub planting, be installed with community involvement, we would be happy to work with you on planning and completing that.
Right there,
Right across the street.
right across the street.
That's what I was thinking.
We've actually.
Brilliant minds think alike.
We actually did that a couple years ago. You might not have been around. We did the silt logs, and we did all the plantings and everything. And within, well, we actually did. When was the flood in 2019? July 17th.
July 21st.
Yeah, we put them in July 18th.
Timing is everything.
But it was the big
Yeah.
the big socks with
Yep.
all the
The stakes
cuttings
and-
yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
But that would be a great location to try that again. I mean, and it's desperately needed there.
And one of the reasons that
It's our park.
the plantings are usually done in March and April, the live stake plantings, or any riparian buffer planting, the best time is in March and April and May, so that you avoid those summer storms. And especially the fall storms. We know that the fall is probably the worst for the tropical systems coming through. And so they get that season to get their root systems started up before they get started. Along the lines of stream cleanups, I know that people plan around Earth Day. I recommend moving it up earlier into the schedule, because you start to get vegetation leaf out by early April now. And so if you can schedule those things closer to the end of March, very early April, people don't get so intimidated by any thorn bushes or other issues that they might encounter when they're in that stream channel. So, and people's perception of safety is as important as the real safety.
So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. The dialogue is fantastic. First, I'd like to give a round of applause to Mary for providing
Yes,
such
thank
an
you.
educational presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And there is material over here. One of them is a homeowner's resource for planning some of these strategies on your property. It actually provides guidance for how to do a map of your property and install some of these things. And then the exhibit is certainly available for you to look at about the watershed-friendly property certification program.
Thank you. And please, for those of you who are here, take some of those resources back to your communities and hand them to your friends, your neighbors, just so that they have the information, to the point that was made, repeatedly. The more we can educate our community, the better off we'll be in this area. So, don't just take one, take several. If you know folks who need to have this information, make sure that we disseminate it as widely as possible. So at this time, we're going to cover the last item on our agenda, which is the public comment question and answer forum. Any questions that you may not have had the opportunity to ask, or issues that you may be having in your respective area that you'd like to bring to the attention of the task force, now's the opportunity. You're welcome to come to the podium and speak on those items, and we'll welcome the dialogue associated with those topics.
My name is Keith Cable. I live at 2216 Chaparral Drive. I want to thank the borough and engineering, Mytal's group, for fixing my property a long time ago. But it was nice to hear that you're still going to improve some more different things. So I just want to bring to attention that I'm still getting water in my backyard, even though they did pipe in part of the creek. But maybe there's something else they can do or something else they can look at. Now this water, when it goes down in between my two houses, in between my house, it goes to the bottom of Chaparral, and the people at the bottom of Chaparral gets my water. So I guess that's branch one that they're getting. So my water comes from the church, Our Lady of Joy. Their water just comes from their parking lot down through the woods. It's not piped in anywhere. I get the water from the cul-de-sac above, and the roof gutters come down my way. So I don't know if there's anything can be done.
Okay, how do you spell your last name?
C-A-B-L-E.
Cable, and you're on Chapter.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna take the information, and it'll be, so one of the things that we,
One of the things that we do on the task force is we have an email address that individuals can use, that all of the individuals who are on the task force have access to that. So if you submit something to the info at Stormwater Task Force at plumborough.com, we'll get that information. And all of those topics get brought up at the Stormwater Task Force meeting, and we go over each one of them. And then we have a dialogue with the borough staff in order to determine if there's a potential resolution to the concern that the resident has that they've brought to the attention of the task force. So we have this information. I know Mike Thomas has been listening, and we'll be able to discuss it collectively. And I'll get your information before we leave this morning, and we'll get back in touch with you and let you know what we've determined.
Yeah, that was only 10 foot from my basement door.
Okay.
Normally, it would come in, and then I lose everything.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for coming, and thank you for bringing that to our attention. Would anyone else like to ask any questions or provide any comments for the remaining time that we have? I know we're a little bit over time, but certainly don't let that discourage you from asking questions or making any comments you might have. Yeah. No, that's okay. Come on, Linda.
I'm Linda Garlitz. I live at 508 Anderson. And I would like to ask you, Mary, the other day we had, I guess it was last week, we had some bad storms. Wednesday was okay at my area. Thursday, I believe, or according to our official rain gauge in our garden, we got 1 inch in about half an hour. And I sent the video to you all. And can you explain to me why my creek would be so muddy? Is that erosion, or what does that mean?
A number of things, and I would defer to you to answer as well, but erosion is certainly Sometimes something done around the construction site, which should be done under the soil and erosion control measures on a site, aren't maintained properly, and so soil that's being cleared from that construction site gets loose, so to speak, and gets into the stream channel. If you see dirt on a road, sometimes you can track it back to either somebody grading a driveway or a new construction site, things along those lines. But a good bit of it very well could be erosion because of weak stream banks upstream. Erosion is a natural process. I should mention that because the Grand Canyon is the result of erosion. So we know that, and all of our channels here are a result of erosion over a very long period of time. But when you see muddy water, it indicates that erosion is happening, or soil deposition and release is happening in the short term. So it's likely to be a combination of things. So.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Linda, I drove by your area about 3 or 4 days ago, dropping off some friends. Anyway, when I kind of stopped and I paused to look, and you can see the areas on the opposite side of the bank that are I saw that are kind of falling off
It's
into the
caving in.
into the creek.
Yes.
When she was talking about this live stakes program, and again, this is something we're going to have to talk about, but I think that area is screaming for something like this. Like, that seems like maybe a doable solution. Again, we need to go look at it. But when she was explaining this live stakes program, I'm like, oh wow, that side of the creek, to get the stabilization we're looking for, that might be a perfect type of mitigation we can put in place there. So I have like all these things I wrote down when you were talking, and we've got a lot of I think stuff to discuss in our next meeting. But I think that's probably one of the things we're going to have to look at sooner rather than later, just based on how things are deteriorating on that side of the stream bank. It is concerning.
It's very
So.
bad. Yes.
And so I'll add, I think the primary focus of the Stormwater Task Force was on flooding, because of that 2019 event. But now, since some of those projects are in process, that the focus will turn to other aspects, of which, of course, one of the tenets of the MS4 program is pollutant reduction, which is not having streams be as muddy. And so the borough will be proceeding with some stream bank restoration type projects of various different natures to try to combat that.
Because I believe they did come in and put that riffraff or riparian, whatever, near the underpass. Well, that didn't last very long.
Yeah, we did it at some of the discharge points, and you're right, in a heavy flow,
Yes.
it'll just carry it off. And
Right.
at a minimum, it'll move some of it, or it'll deposit other silt and sedimentation on top of it, which yeah.
I mean, I appreciate the efforts, but, yeah.
As you mentioned in the film, when you get a large amount of rain in a short period of time, it can't absorb, it flows. So you gain volume, you gain speed. Volume and speed cause erosion. Plus, like I said, that particular stream that you're dealing with drains almost 2/3 of the borough.
Well,
So you're getting a little bit of dirt here, a little bit of dirt here, a little bit of dirt there. By the time it gets to you, it's a lot of dirt, a lot
Right.
of water.
So,
okay.
and also one of the things that we had talked about, Dave, you and I, and I think we talked about this in the task force meeting, I can't remember, was transitioning this group into an EAC.
Right, NESC, yeah.
So that we could have an EAC that could be focused on some of these other water quality issues, riparian buffer issues, all these things, education and outreach. I think we kind of felt that was the natural progression of this group. So that is the long-term plan for this group, I think. I don't want to speak for everybody, but my recommendation was that this group would sort of transition into an EAC for the borough. And certainly, I think the primary focus, at least early on, would be on these sort of water quality and water and erosion issues.
Dave, you remember months ago when that woman had called in about a water problem she thought was the borough, and I went up and looked at it.
Right.
And here was the downspouts from the neighbors coming into her yard. Well, I told her, I said, it's not a borough problem. You have to call the Allegheny County Health Department. You may want to do that, sir. Call the health department, plumbing division. And they will send an inspector out. And they'll dye test. They'll dye test all the drain leaders and everything to find out where the water's going and if it's tied. If it's not tied in, they will make them.
Now, is the roof supposed to be tied into somewhere now?
It has to be tied in. It
Storm,
can't just
and
be
the storm,
dumped
you gotta
in.
make sure it's
Yeah,
a storm and
right,
not
a
sanitary.
storm, not sanitary.
Yes.
There's no more combination sewers. It's separate now.
Well, if there is storm there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Not every, like my
Right.
house doesn't have a storm in front of it or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, if you,
But you can't divert it onto someone else's
Property.
That
Correct.
seems to be the problem with
Yes.
this gentleman
Could
over
be,
here.
could be.
so we require that if the storm pipe is in, the street, and you can get, if your street's up here and your backyard is down here and your leaders are going down, you can't get it up there. But we require that if you have the ability to tie into the storm sewers, we require your leaders to be tied into them. But I will tell you, that's probably less than half the properties in Plum that have that ability to tie into the storm drains. Maybe even more, like a third.
Yeah, it's certainly not.
It's not a lot.
For sure.
I was going to offer one more point in terms of the question about stream banks. The program with live stakes is really good for moderate scale projects or small scale projects primarily. There might be the need for something more extensive, which would be a stream restoration project, which is getting hard equipment in there and pulling that stream bank back to restore access to the floodplain, if that's even feasible.
Right.
We recognize that's not feasible in heavily developed areas because you have private property encroachment and that kind of thing. But I do want to just point out that the live stake alternative is an option for, the smaller scale issues. It's not something that's going to help when you need to try and get access to the floodplain that would have normally slowed that water down and allowed it to.
Any other questions or comments?
I also want to say thank you very much. I am grateful for your efforts. I had no idea how involved it is myself.
Yeah, well, we're.
As a victim, you want it immediately, and it obviously can't happen.
Yeah, and having, talked to a number of residents immediately following the events of 2019, we definitely, and some of we are members of the task force. We know what individuals went through, and we're not going to forget it. And we're going to continue our efforts to do everything we can, whether it's on a stormwater task force or whether it becomes an environmental advisory, council. We want to make sure that we continue to make this task force what the public intended it to be, which is a proactive way to continue to manage, the stormwater efforts in the borough. Because it is a substantial, challenge, but, we recognize that. And I think we're making progress, but it's, there's no silver bullet for this. And ultimately, what makes it work is the continuous effort to address it and stay on top of it. And we hope we can continue to do that for you. One of the things I did want to put out in closing is that we continue to welcome input from the community. You can contact the task force via email at plumstormwatertaskforce@plumborough.com. Please don't hesitate to use that email address. It goes to every member of the task force. And like I said before, every email that we get, substantive email that we get, will be brought up on the agenda for the next stormwater meeting. We go over them all, and we try to get back to every individual who sends us, information at that particular email address. So for those of you who are here, for those of you who may be watching this after the fact, please use that email address to contact us so that we can work to address any of the issues that you may have. And with that, I'd really like to thank all of you for attending. We certainly think that this won't be the last one of these that we conduct. Hopefully we can put one on sooner rather than later. I know it took us a year to get this one done, but that was predominantly due to the logistical challenges of COVID. And we don't foresee, hopefully, that we'll have to go back to that. Let's all cross our fingers. But the task force will be working to schedule another one of these, maybe not this type of forum, but certainly, maybe a smaller venue, where we bring in some of these, experts to provide some of the fabulous, educational resources that they have. I think that's something that the community would be able to benefit from. And so we'll be working to maybe come up with some additional venues to, offer up those educational opportunities for the community. But thank you again for attending. And with that, we will adjourn.